Hello, everyone. Wait a couple seconds more for a few more people to filter in, and then we'll get started. All right. Thank you all so much for joining us on this frigid winter's day for a true literary treat. My name is Rachel Small. I'm the Director of Publicity at Astra Publishing House, and I am thrilled to introduce the Astra House Spring 2026 debut preview. Today, we'll hear from two brilliant authors and their editors on novels that allow us to see the world through new eyes and tackle serious questions with elegance, wisdom, and a healthy dose of humor. Morgan Day's The Oldest Bitch Alive, acquired by Tara Sharma, and Avigayl Sharp's Offseason, acquired by Emily Bell. Just a tiny bit of housekeeping before we begin. As a reminder, this is a webinar, and thus only our authors and editors will have mics and cameras on. The chat and Q&A are open for now, so feel free to ask questions there, and if we have time, we'll try to answer them. And now it's my sincere pleasure to introduce our first author-editor pair. Morgan Day is a fiction and architecture writer. Her short fiction has appeared in Ecotone, Gulf Coast, the Southampton Review, Worms Magazine, and elsewhere. She grew up in Northern California and lives in Tucson, Arizona. Her debut novel, The Oldest Bitch Alive, which Edward P. Jones called captivating, a work of quiet and yet spirited exhilaration, will be published on March 24th and was acquired by Tara Sharma. Tara Sharma is an associate editor at Astra House, where she publishes Morgan Day, Esther Yee, Anne Scott, Julia Kornberg, Ben Eastham, and Nicolette Pollack, among others. Across fiction and nonfiction, Tara is drawn to formally inventive, deeply researched works that catalyze relationships between different knowledge systems, test narrative, bend and collapse scales, and reveal something new about perception, relation, language, and meaning making. Previously, Tara was an assistant editor at FSG, where she worked on a range of award-winning and best-selling publications by authors including Tove Ditlevsen, Christina Sharp, Rachel Aviv, David Graeber, Judith Butler, and Andrea Martin. And now, without further ado, I'll pass it over to Morgan to read briefly from.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm going to read the first paragraph of the first chapter, which is called The Orb. On the day Gelsomina contracts worms, she is no different from who she has always been, an animal walking on all fours. The old French bulldog rifles through leather flowers and fruit bushes. She rolls in dry soil, then sniffs the belly of a fallen starling. Her thirst steers her to the murky backyard lake. She laps water with blue-green foam, gulping pollen and mini bees. It is rich in flavor, an oily muck she likes. Along with sludge, an opaque egg drifts into her system, carrying 5 parasitic worms, beginning their migration from the mouth to the intestines. Gelsomina wanders up a gentle slope to the glass house. Wendy opens the door as she arrives, reaching down with a towel to rub her wet paws. Clean and dry, Gelsomina enters the living space, leaps onto a heather tweed chaise, and falls asleep within the dunes of a fir throw. That's the first chapter, or the first paragraph. Tara, I could give an introduction to the book, more than that, unless you want to.
Yeah, go for it. That would be cool.
So the first paragraph kind of starts to get at it, but the main thrust of the book is there's a French bulldog, Gelsomina, who is really old, and one day she ingests this orb of parasitic worms who start to further her deterioration, but then at the same time she has a sort of awakening to the natural world beyond the domesticated realm. So the book is about that process and a sort of enlightenment while at the same time tracking the way in which this other organism can take over another form.
Awesome. Thanks, Morgan. I love that first paragraph so much, and it's wonderful to start the conversation with it. And hello, everyone here. I'm so happy to be here with all of you and to speak with you. or to speak with Morgan today and share with all of you a bit about The Oldest Bitch Alive, which was my first acquisition here at Astra. And it's really difficult to overstate how much of an absolute dream it has been to edit and publish this book, and most of all, to work with Morgan and to get to explore her ideas and experiments together. This book has really forever changed my conception of what a novel can do, has really kind of stretched the genre of fiction entirely for me. And I know it will for you too when you read this book. We just received this really moving quote from a bookseller yesterday who says it better than I can. This bookseller says that this book does nothing short of inventing a syntax. Think of Morrison's credo that if there is a book you want to read that hasn't been written yet, you must write it yourself. Where the English language is now capable of capturing and depicting animal consciousness equally as well as human. Yeah, and I had been really fantasizing about a novel like this for a really long time. And when Morgan's manuscript came upon my desk, it was like sort of precisely at this moment that I was attempting to articulate something of a vision I had of a kind of ecological fiction that is a novel that's interested in ideas of non-human language and perception and agency. On the nonfiction side, it feels like books exploring this subject matter, kind of embracing the idea that there are whole systems of intelligence that non-human life forms hold. These books are kind of at an all-time level of popularity on the nonfiction side, but I hadn't really encountered fiction that had enacted these theories until I'd read Morgan's novel. So Morgan, maybe we could start there. This book is really interested in questions of material eco-criticism, a body of ideas, thought that I think we've both been really drawn to in our lives. Could you kind of introduce us a bit to this world of ideas? Tell us a little bit about what you find interesting about them, and sort of why you decided to kind of turn to fiction to explore them, what it was like metabolizing these ideas in this form, and what the novel form sort of afforded you with them.
Yeah, definitely. So material eco-criticism is this idea that all matter has narrative agency. So every single object and being in our world is a site of a story. And I think I really understood this at an abstract level, but it started to frustrate me at a literal level. And I wanted to understand it as much as I could literally. And I thought that the novel was a place to explore that. Um, so I started out with um, trying to create these different experiences across scales. And I think that throughout the book, there's this tension that operates, and that I don't know if I ever really reached my answer, where there's the barrier of my humanness that gets in the way of reaching the pure expression of these objects and beings. But I would say, on a more interesting or positive note, what ended up happening was that by giving every single thing across scales equal presence and space and size, from the microscopic and the parasitic worms to the holistic universe, the scale ended up collapsing. So you have this equal level playing field, or a level plane for all of them to act out within and beside each other. And then the other concept that was really important to the book, that I think is a little bit more familiar to everyone, is this idea of transcorporeality, um, which basically means that we often see ourselves as like our skin is a barrier or a wall, when actually it's porous. And this is the driving force of our enmeshment with other beings and also our environments. So a major focus of the book was trying to see that play out. So you have, as I mentioned, the worms, they're inside Gelsomina, and they can be this enlightening presence, but at the same time, parasitic worms can control behavior and they control the mind and can control the way someone views the world. So I was also looking at that too.
Cool. Yeah, I think that kind of like sort of opens up some more questions about form in general, and I would love to think a little bit more about form. The book is like explicitly interested in questions of form and design and architecture. Of course, there's the couple, Wendy and John, a designer and an architect who construct this glass house, in which the sort of novel unfolds in reference to, and who kind of share this sort of intellectual interest in form. The novel is interested in kind of containers of different sizes. There's the glass house, this sort of pristine object. There's the orb from which the worms emerge, and then there's the kind of lumpy, nebulous French bulldog body. There's Gelsomina's intestinal tract, where the worms sort of devise their home, and these containers kind of come to act as different constraints for the writing. And then, of course, the book actually experiments with form by moving through multiple perspectives. There's the omniscient narrative voice, which is sort of a voice of steady empiricism. There's the voice of these two worms, which kind of each of which represents a distinct life philosophy. And then there's Gelsomina's voice. And it's interesting. Gelsomina is interested in so many of the same questions of architecture and form that Wendy and John are, but she encounters them sort of fresh and in this kind of like prelingual place, and embodies them. And so, yeah, each of these voices, as you sort of have been discussing, it allow the reader access to different scales of reality and different scales of life, that may not be immediately legible to us. So I would love to hear about kind of how you found each of these voices, and in particular, how you found Gelsomina's voice, which is really hard to describe, but maybe you can try to.
Yeah, I love prelingual. But yeah, I think the revolving perspectives started with my inability to choose. So I think that I had looked at just an omniscient narrator. I had really looked at just having this filtered through Gelsomina's voice and lens, but I thought that you lose a sort of bird's eye view of her that would be important, especially contained within the glass house. And those containers were really important. And I think if you're inside one lens, you only have certain angles of all those containers. But Gelsomina's voice, for whatever reason, it felt like our sort of standard like sentence structure was inadequate for her experience. And I wanted something that was equal parts literal in its communication. So when you read the words, you know what they're saying, not all the time with her. But then there's also equally just a sensorial experience. So there are times I think in her voice where you could be reading and not necessarily know exactly what's going on, but the point is more so to understand the feeling that's created. Um, and then the worms, they have this philosophical voice and they talk about things like morality. And I had come across this information of how worms have all the memories of their ancestors going back to the very first worm. And I thought that they kind of had this, as a character in the book, became sort of this ancient presence, and they had this sort of like original wisdom that I wanted to get across. And then the omniscient voice has I don't know, an almost clinical tone at times. Um, and I think that what ended up happening was the book almost operates as like a hybrid nonfiction fiction filter through a fictional lens, where as I was doing research for the book, there's a lot of science that's sort of the bedrock for it. And I think what ended up happening was that I was coming across these scientific facts and hypotheses rooted in fact that felt so absurd and so surreal that it was like more absurd than any fiction that I could come up with. And I didn't want this fiction to supersede that. I wanted them to operate equally. Um, so what, and the experience that I wanted to have was that as you're reading the book, you don't know what's fact and what's not. So some of these scientific facts, yeah, they're so absurd that as you're reading them, you think that they're part of these more fantastical elements of the book, but they're actually true. Um, so I think that's what ended up the form of the book and the structure evolved organically in that way with as those interests of mine started to like build and grow.
Could you maybe give us an example of a scientific fact that is sort of, I don't know, blends into fiction as it is, or sort of,
Yeah.
yeah, causes, I don't know, yeah, a scientific fact sort of in this vein.
Well, it's not like a fact, but there's this theory rooted in facts that we are in a bubble universe. This is in the first chapter too. Um, Among many other bubble universes. So we're like within our bubble, next to all these other bubbles, in like a bed of foam. And that's like the construction of everything. And I thought that that was like incredible because we can look at sort of like foam on the ocean and it's this kind of small effervescent like disintegrating thing that just kind of like dissolves before our eyes, but at the same time, it's like the construction of like this hard reality that we live within. I thought that was amazing, and of course, was really interesting because there's this like focus on like the worms come out of the orb, and that's like this sort of they have like a lot of reverence for their original egg, their orb. So then I thought it was just beautiful that we're like in our orb among all these other orbs with orbs inside.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. The other one that really comes to mind is the idea of selfing, which I remember in one of our very early um, editorial conversations. I was like, did you invent this? Is this real? Maybe you could tell people a little bit about selfing.
Yeah, I love selfing. Also, the I couldn't believe that that was the word because I thought it was just like perfect. That's another example of just like I could never come up with something. It was just like so perfect. And it's like, yeah, I just felt like at least my fiction could never meet that. But anyway, yeah, selfing is when like a worm doesn't have an adequate partner, like sexual partner, and then they self-propagate. So they like form a little orb at their like the collar, and then that creates more orbs of worms, and then they can just kind of like keep going that way. Um, so there's a lot of selfing in the book because one of the worms is has an inadequate partner.
And self reproduces. So crazy. Yeah, that kind of continues to blow my mind. Um, yeah, which kind of leads me to like sort of question about like obsession that is kind of the undercurrent of the book. Yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit more about like the origin of the book, where the idea began and how it evolved. If there was a kind of critical moment at which you felt like you kind of unlocked something essential about the book overall, figured out what the novel was going to be. And maybe, Morgan, this is an opportunity to speak a little bit about your kind of core interest in the French bulldog, about society's interest in dogs and the French bulldog more specifically. I feel like nearly every time I leave the Astra office, I'm confronted with a Frenchie on the streets of Flatiron. And it's hard to say that we lock eyes because their eyes are often in this sort of distant, faraway place. And so, yeah, maybe you could sort of speak about the dog, and also about kind of the other texts and images and forms of media that guided you while writing. So yeah, what were some of the sort of animating obsessions at the core of this project? What was driving you?
Yeah. No, I know the Frenchy like lacquer gaze you're talking about on like the side of their heads. But yeah, I think the book had a different start. I knew I've had Frenchies and I knew I wanted to write about the French Bulldog. And the book was originally a fairy tale. I think that I felt that my interest wasn't literary enough. So I needed to filter it through this sort of fairy tale setting in order for it to be valid, I guess, in a literary sense. And so I wrote a majority of that book where the French bulldog was just at the center of a fairy tale, but it was really uninteresting to me, and it didn't feel exciting or new in any way. And then, so I didn't know what to do with it. And then one day I was looking at Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights, which like everything is like enmeshed and within, beside, whatever. Um, so I started looking at that and I'm like, that is what I would hope to try to aim for on the page in terms of enmeshment with like animals and like move beyond the fairy tale. And then I think also what happened was that I kind of got rid of this idea of what is literary or not and just fully allowed myself to follow the interest of like I love Frenchies and I'm just gonna like try to understand as best as I can what their experience is as like honestly as I can. So like what is it if I can like get down to her like gaze in like this house with the amount of information that she has, which is both more and less than me. Like what does that look like? Um, I also think that I started like in terms of core interests, and we've talked about this before, I started realizing that there were sort of these shapes that I was interested in that were coming up in this book. And then like other writing where I like was really interested in the circle. And like if you think about it, like a proper Frenchie is like a small circle head and a circle body, and then there are these orbs and like the bubble universes. Miniature horses I really like. They're sort of like pot-bellied and like I was like, what is this fascination? Still kind of getting at that. But then I like recently was reading about how I'm reading a book by Beckett right now, and I was reading about how beforehand he was really interested in this idea of the line is like an infinite circle. And then you start to see all of these sort of like repetitive actions across his books. So you have someone who like in Malloy, he's like putting stones in his pocket and then he like sucks on them and then he like rotates which ones he sucks and puts in his mouth. And then he like there's like this person who sits at the bar and they sit on each stool and then they start from the beginning. There's someone else who's like humanity is a bucket of water going like being emptied and going down and then being filled and going back up. Anyway, so I was like, okay, there's something here with like shapes and like circles and like the infinite and sort of like origins in the beginning that like I am seeing in these animals that are like robust and sort of rotund and like shaped in this way, that there's a sort of like purity and like original essence to them that I revere. And then that's where a lot of the project came from.
That's very powerful. Gelsomina as the original essence and the sort of pure, rotund, infinite circle. I think that's a very nice image to end on. And yeah, this was so fun. Thank you, Morgan. And I will pass it back to Rachel.
Thank you so much, Tara and Morgan. The whole idea of The Oldest Bitch Alive is hybrid fiction and nonfiction, and like the absurdness of fact. I feel like I now need to reread the book from that perspective, because it's just sort of like blasts it open for me, which is so exciting to think about rereading this book with a totally new lens. So thank you. I will now introduce our second author editor pair. Avigayl Sharp is a writer from Chicago. Her fiction has appeared in the Paris Review, Granta, New England Review, and other publications, and has received support from Yaddo, the Granum Foundation, and the Desperate Literature Short Fiction Prize. She was the winner of the 2023 DISQUIET Literary Prize and a 2023-24 Writing Fellow at the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown. Avigayl received her BA from Wesleyan University and her MFA from the Michener Center for Writers in Austin, Texas, where she was the fiction editor of Bat City Review. She is an assistant editor at American Short Fiction. Avigayl, if you can join us and turn on your camera. Thank you. Catherine Lacey has called Avigayl's debut novel, Offseason, obscenely good and very funny. It will be published on May 5th and was acquired by Emily Bell. Emily Bell is the editorial director of Astra House, where she publishes Avigayl Sharp, Laurie Osland, Erin McGlock, Ashton Politanoff, Michelle Orange, Karen Olson, and Nikki Irvice, among others. Previously, she was the head of editorial at Zando, where she edited Lydia Kiesling's Mobility and Holly Wilson's Kitten Tits, among other titles. She also curated and published the Atlantic Editions, a publishing partnership with the Atlantic magazine. Prior to Zando, Emily spent a decade at FSG, most recently as an executive editor and the director of the paperback original line, FSG Originals, which launched early work from Amelia Gray, Catherine Lacey, and Laura Vandenberg. And now I will pass it over to Avigayl to read from her.
Thank you, Rachel, and hi, everyone. It was so great to hear you talk about your book, Morgan. I'm like very, very excited to read it. I will now read the first paragraph from Offseason by Avigayl Sharp. It's kind of a long paragraph, but we'll see how it goes. It has no title. I arrived at the academy on a Tuesday in early September, one of the last weeks that the ferry would be operating for the season. My journey involved a train ride to a major coastal metropolis in the Northeast, then an hour's trip by boat to the remote tourist town in which the school was located. I departed early in the morning and watched through the train windows as the sun came up over virtuosic fields of subsidized corn, obese cows, miserable horses, so-called rivers, green, rank, oily with pollution. My seat smelled strongly of old coffee and hard-boiled eggs. I fell asleep with my cheek pressed against the glass and awoke to the sensation of my right foot being squeezed through its shoe in a firm and rhythmic pulsing motion, as in a resuscitation. The man occupying the seat next to mine was leaning forward, torso folded at the waist like a collapsible chair, his face amazingly close to my knees. Upon noticing that I was conscious, he jerked upright, lay back in his seat, and pretended to be asleep himself, putting on a series of ostentatious little gurgling noises, his head, with its hair the color of an unripe peach, lolling floppily upon its neck. I knew this was all a show designed to trick and tranquilize me, but the man's babyish sounds were nonetheless soothing, and I was lulled easily back into sleep. I hadn't had sex in a long time. There were certain thinkers who might claim that I had never had sex, though I was not one of these thinkers. I was pretty sure I had had sex on many occasions. I was 28 years old. When I woke up again, the man was reading a magazine whose glossy cover featured a photograph of an aging celebrity seated in a pool chair with her legs spread, wearing a striped tankini. In large yellow lettering, the caption read, "I don't give a damn if you call me a fatty."
Sorry to everyone who had to watch me laughing about that. Not because it isn't unbelievably funny, but because it's weird to watch somebody laugh on mute. But thank you, Abigail. Truly, truly genius. And as you were reading it, it was reminded that one of my favorite things about your book is like how like the book feels like simultaneously like always romantic and disgusting. Like it's just so at the same time. And also I was reminded how European this book feels. And if listeners, viewers might have noticed that Abigail talked about or mentioned that it was, you know, a town in the Northeast, which was something I kind of asked her to do. It was like the only note I gave you. Just to kind of locate us in the United States, because there is something very European about this book in many ways. And I, you know, thought it might be fun. Abigail is currently in Germany, has been living in Germany, and I was curious if you would just tell us a little bit about like Europe as an aesthetic influence and like literary and otherwise, and about how certain places, certain cities have informed your writing.
Yes, absolutely. I will talk about Europe. You can tell that it's Germany because it's like so dark here, although it is 6:30 p.m. and it's starting to finally like get a little stay light a little later, but that's still like four o'clock.
I could smell the schnitzel too.
Yeah, you can tell the amount of schnitzel that I've consumed in the past like 9 months is so obscene, and maybe that's the number
You should
one
just
influence
take
on my
pictures
work.
of all the schnitzel, and that could be our marketing campaign.
That could be my next novel. I mean, I
Yeah.
do think about how there's something funny about the way that I came to Germany. I'm living in a town outside of a small city outside of Hamburg because my husband has an academic fellowship here, so we sort of moved for the year. And there's something that's like very off season about the whole project of sort of departing one place, going to another place in which there's a sort of sense of alienation from the space, a kind of that kind of dislocation, and sort of historically Germany plays a role in the book as well. And I was like, oh, I can't write off-season part two about just like living in Germany. Yeah, the European influence, it's interesting because I do think that off-season combines a kind of very like formally European aesthetic in a certain way. And maybe I'm thinking specifically of like there's an influence of a kind of W.G. Sebald and these elliptical novels in which an unnamed narrator engages in kind of conversations and interactions with people throughout a space. There's a lot of like taking trains. There's a journey that opens off season. There's another journey back to the city. And I mean, there are other European novels that definitely have an influence as well, like Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, in which the protagonist sort of like departs the city of Hamburg to go like pretend to have tuberculosis for 7 years and in a very weird sanatorium where he like encounters different intellectual ideas and like falls in love with someone's x-ray and essentially like tries not to have a job. And that feels like a lot of what off-season is sort of interested in also. I think there's maybe something about this like very burrowing interiority, the sense of a narrator that you have a lot of access to like the mind and the world of the mind of the narrator while also being held at a certain level of distance. And I think I find that in certain traditions of European novels and I mean also like Kafka and Robert Walser and Thomas Bernhard and Proust, you know, I haven't read all of Proust, but slowly I make my way through. But then I think there's also a way that this novel is super American, like it has a very American comic sensibility. And I don't know, there was something I really wanted to push these two things together. I hadn't really seen it much, I thought, wouldn't it be funny if you had like a really kind of almost slapstick, absurdist American comic novel that met the more interior, elliptical, digressive European novel, and that's what happened.
You accomplish it so brilliantly. I cannot emphasize enough to you all how hilarious this book is, and I think one way that you like one avenue for that is the adolescent girl. I'm now sort of jumping ahead to my questions, but that does feel like a very like sort of American way to like to map this onto them, and you write them so well. And my kind of understanding of your project, like your larger project, tell me if I'm being ridiculous, but is to like simultaneously take seriously and make fun of something, and like who better than the teenage girl to do that to, because they're ridiculous but also like they're brilliant, like, and I worked on a book a while ago about how basically they like invented the modern internet with like Tumblr, etc. And teenage girls are brilliant, and they're so savvy, but they're also like the most like self-centered like humans on the planet. And I think it's like it's just there's such a perfect vehicle to explore exactly that. And so I guess like I'm curious about your experience with teenage girls, and just how, like, I mean, I assume, and I've never asked you this, but like that you have spent some time teaching them, because it comes up in obviously in the novel, but also in your some of your stories. But I don't know, like just like an anthropological adventure into the teenage girl. Could you give me some?
Absolutely. I could talk about teenage girls for hours. What's funny is that I've never actually taught high school. Like I've returned to the sort of image of this female teacher in like multiple forms, but I worked at a high school. I like worked in an administrative role, and I became really preoccupied with um the idea of a sort of adult woman in a space of adolescent girls who is herself kind of infantile and regressed, and like what would happen there. I mean, I think that, like you said, the teenage girl is such a compelling figure because it's so contradictory. Like I think when I think back on being a teenage girl, first of all, I'm like, I was never a teenage girl. And then I'm like, I was always a teenage girl. There's something about it that feels very alien, difficult to pin down. And I do not think of it as a time of sort of carefree innocence. I don't like no one does, but of sort of horrible, like internal terror and violence, and like also extreme beauty and just a real intensity of feeling and sort of states of being that also seem to me to have something to do with like coming to terms both with the capacity to do harm and to be harmed, and to be at once extraordinarily like innocent and not innocent at all, and you're kind of trying on a new body and a new language and a new like a whole new symbolic way of being, that is in theory supposed to be natural, and like but I don't remember there being anything natural about it. I feel like I had to create myself out of cunning and wit. Like you have to really, this kind of identity formation is like such a strange thing to do, and can be very humiliating. And so I don't know. There's something about like the teenage adolescent girl, and the incredible capacities in all directions, and also like the attempt of an adult to deny that, to sort of not look at it because it's way too because it induces too much, like it's way too close to home in a certain way, that I do kind of go there again and again.
Yeah. Like for good reason. I was gonna say it's so fertile, and that's gross, but not inaccurate. It's remarkable. But the scenes around the girls are some of my favorite. Because and like vice versa, like they both like
occasionally take her seriously as a teacher, but then are just like so utterly dismissive of this person who is making herself incredibly vulnerable up there in front of all these girls. And I guess that's something I'm very interested in too, is this sort of her vulnerability. Like there's so much about like the sort of her body and the physicality, but I do almost picture her like naked moving through the world, because she's so, to use a Morgan Day word, she's so porous. Like everything is like in and out at the same time. And I was thinking about it too in terms of music, and specifically singing in public, because that is something that is sort of a motif throughout the book. Music, classical music, but also this like singing and the crazy vulnerability of singing in public, or at least like I experienced that. And so I'm curious about, I don't know, like your interest in music, your choice to have it be something that repeats in the novel. Certainly, they're like the the European allusions there, but yeah, I'm curious about the use of music, and also your experience with singing and performance.
Yes, and this is when I burst into song.
And then I'll like try to sing your harmonies. And be like,
finally, I can put on a show. No, I mean, in a very like literal sense, I have a relationship to music and to classical music because my parents are classical musicians, which is a trait that I like donated to the narrator of Offseason and found very useful for her to have.
Yeah.
And like I think I what's interesting is that I don't feel that I know a lot about classical music, like in an intellectual sense. Like it's something that was just it was in the house, and it was I studied violin and piano, and I sang in a choir pretty seriously until college. And so like the way that music meant something to me was in, I don't even like an embodied way, or yeah, so something sort of separate from the world of the mind, as the narrator would put it. And I think that her relationship to music is sort of one places in the novel where it's not really it's not about the self. Like music is something very powerful for her, like teenage girls. Like it reaches towards something very deep and very unconscious, and almost kind of like transcendent, almost sublime, but that's actually something that's the reason that it's so terrifying to her. So she speaks frequently about having sung in the past, and she no longer sings, and she fixates on one student who is a singer. And I think singing in particular maybe involves a kind of giving over of yourself, like literally of your voice, like you're literally instrumentalizing yourself for someone else's language and like someone else's music, and for something that's just beyond the self, and that's sort of part of a collective in some way. And this is in particular is I think because she's so porous, as you said, which I think is completely true, like she longs to be subsumed in this way, but I think she also finds it totally terrifying. Like the self could totally dissolve. She would be made completely vulnerable. There's no way out. And I think she feels this way about like beauty in general. So she has a real longing for and fear of beauty, art, love, but maybe singing in particular, in which you're so literally giving your voice over to something else.
Cool. The student that you speak of who does sing, she is also a student that like has a I won't, it's not really a spoiler, but she's the one who has like some kind of a relationship with the male teacher who has gone on leave, which is why our narrator has this job in the first place. And that kind of like that sets up the novel, where like it's suggested, or like we assume, the reader assumes, because this is because of the world we live in today, that like something inappropriate happened between the student and the teacher. And this is kind of just me telling the group, because it's such a brilliant like sort of setup and conceit. And the kind of the arc of the book is like us sort of trying to figure out, like, did something happen or not between this female student and the male teacher, who our narrator ends up like having a relationship herself with. But also there's this kind of not backstory, but like history of our narrator, who in high school had like a sexual encounter with another male student, who like maybe it was sort of sort of I'm looking for consensual, or maybe it wasn't. And so like that I think is it's hard to explain. Like when I'm like pitching this book, I'm like, how much time do you have? But like totally genius, this idea that like of not knowing, like when is it, like when did something bad happen and how bad was it and when am I meant to get over it? And that is like sort of the and that sort of interest in our like culture's obsession with like trying to figure out who did what and how bad was it, and how harmed was someone and for how long do they get to carry this pain along with them. And it's just like it's universal, but the like those kind of existential issues like you write about with such humor, and it's so fun to read and so unbelievably funny. This is the funniest book I have ever read in my life, hands down. And I am wondering, what is the funniest book that you have ever read? You can't say your own.
I was about to make that joke. Well, that's so nice. Thank you. Also, that was a really great description of the book and how it works.
I disagree, but you're nice.
That was great. I knew this question was coming, and I still like I was like, oh, it's so hard to choose one, but I also think that when someone tells you to choose the funniest, like you have to choose one.
Yeah.
And so I'm just gonna say it, and then okay, I'm gonna say, because we were also talking about Joy Williams earlier. Joy Williams' The Quick and the Dead is maybe, I think that's the funniest book I've ever read. I mean, Joy Williams is in touch with like the beyond, and that is also, I think, comedy. I'm not like, I want comedy to be doing something. I just want it to be doing something. Like I'm not someone who like looks for like a couple of laughs in a book. Like sometimes I really either want a book to be like completely serious and unfun. Like I love a really unfunny book, actually. Like
yeah.
I love a book where I'm like, no laughs allowed. Or a book that sort of uses comedy to move us into really strange or difficult terrain. And that's what Joy Williams does. And so
that's an excellent answer. And I agree. It's the second funniest book I've ever read. But also, I'm sorry for asking that question, because I have like sort of friends and peers who are like, what's your favorite book? I was like, I don't think you understand what I do. I don't like I just like books all the time and wonderful ones, and then it's not like that.
I know, but you have to pick one. You just have to. Otherwise, it's not fair.
Mine's Offseason. Mine's whatever book I'm working on at the time. Sorry. Also when Morgan and Tara were talking, they were talking about The Oldest Bitch Alive as like a novel of obsessions, and I would describe this book that way as well, which is so funny because they're so incredibly different. But it made me wonder if you have any like current obsessions that are maybe making their way into your work, aside from teenage girls and slapstick humor. But if you have any preoccupations right now that you want to just open-endedly talk about.
Yeah, I'll talk about my current obsession, which is probably not going to make it into my work, but I've been watching a lot of Charlie Chaplin movies. Okay, so my current obsession is like the absolute sublime beauty of Charlie Chaplin when he's like doing a little dance.
Yeah.
And I mean, I like movies a lot. Like I find the film form to be something that I could never, ever, ever imagine doing, because I could never imagine like collaborating with another person on a piece of art, except for you, Emily. And so that's one obsession. I'm actually trying to think of like, I get obsessions with really kind of like strange and minute things at certain points that are like not really useful for my literary project. Like I will get really obsessed with like doing skincare, and then it only like erupts my face. And then, but I feel like there's something about like all of my obsessions have a kind of like death drive in them. Like none of them are that fertile. And like I sometimes think that there's a way that I'm like all I am is someone who like reads books and then tries to write them. Like all of my
That's
obsessions.
not bad though. That's like
No,
really
it's not.
not a
No,
bad,
no.
it's not a
Yeah,
bad
and you
way.
have to know what you are. Like at a certain
Yeah.
point, you do have to just know. Yeah,
I
and
think okay, first of all, that the skincare stuff will definitely make it into your work.
it
Has made
actually will. You're yeah.
there's one line that my husband and I talk about all the time where he read the book too. And it's something about how like the narrator is like, I understood that men wanted girls to look like um wet babies with a brain problem, and we like died laughing. And now we walk around town like, this is not nice. I'm not a nice person, but like being like, it's a wet baby with a brain problem. It's so funny. And so anyway, so your skincare routines have definitely
Yeah,
really
they've
made it
permeated.
good. But
Yeah.
also like that's like a wonderful existence, I think, to just like read books and try to write them. Like if you can do that, like keep doing that. I'm envious. I can't write them and I don't know how to read either, so it's not my life. um maybe I've had too much coffee this morning. I'm sorry for all of the people watching. Also, you can't see their faces, so you can't be like, oh, you're a ridiculous human who continues to talk even though you're gone totally off topic. But I encourage you all to read this brilliant book. If I haven't made it clear enough, like it is so funny. It is highly elusive. It is operating on so many different levels. And I think like the true like genius of this book is that it feels like, or not feels, it is like totally deliberate. Like every choice is so like is painstakingly made, and it also feels like utterly inspired. So it is a work of pure genius. And I'm very excited that it's coming out in a matter of months.
Thank you, Emily.
Yeah.
I am too. Thank you so much, Emily and Abigail. And what you said about I was never a teenage girl. I'm always a teenage girl. Like it resonates so deeply personally and with when I think about the narrator's voice and her presence around all these teenage girls. Thank you all so much again for joining us. Special thanks to Morgan Day, Avigayl Sharp, Tara Sharma, and Emily Bell for those fascinating conversations. We hope you feel inspired to go out and read these fantastic debut novels. A reminder that you can request digital copies of both The Oldest Bitch Alive and Underspin on NetGalley and Edelweiss. There are links in the chat. Feel free to go in now while the webinar is still open. And click them. If you prefer physical review copies, you can email us at ahpublicity@astrahouse.com. That's also in the chat. We have a couple minutes for questions if there are any. Feel free to type them or raise your hand. But otherwise, thanks so much. Enjoy the rest of your day and happy reading.